各位嘉宾您好，欢迎莅临今天晚上的 We Are Making 系列讲座实践创作的第一步。我们非常荣幸，就是能够有机会邀请到杂志的创办人 Dale Dory 先生，以及日本的 Orally 杂志的负责人庄默先生。那同时呢，我们今天特别邀请到了国内机器人制作界的堪称是第一把交椅的李祖生教授，他们都在会场跟我们分享他们在制作、创造跟 DIY 心得。那同时，我们今天的主持人方面呢，我们非常荣幸的邀请到了 TEDx Taipei 的 Jason 来为我们主持，以及会后座谈的部分。那我们现在就欢迎 Jason， 谢谢。
各位Maker 的朋友，还有各位TEDx 台北还有 TED 的朋友，大家晚安。晚安。不知道这里面有多少人听过 TED.com， 然后有多少人听过 TEDx 台北？哦，还好有一些，谢谢你们。其实这一次就是蛮荣幸受邀来跟各位介绍今天这一位非常重量级的特别来宾。那我跟 Maker 结缘其实是透过 TED， 因为Maker 的创办人 Dale 他也是 TED 的 speaker 之一。那我自己也去过在美国加州办的 Maker Fair， 然后我记得我去的时候，非常的感到震惊，因为我觉得从小到大每个男孩子都有的那个梦想，那个想要做 do something， 还有 make some stuff 的那一种梦想，我在那边看到了。我看到小朋友他做了一个机器人，然后会跑，然后这个机器人有时候会喷火，然后做了自己手工 DIY 的一个遥控直升机，我觉得非常的了不起。然后我回来台湾的时候，我就觉得台湾有没有可能有这样子的一件事情，一个 movement。然后我又想到，其实台湾在过去的历史里面，这一种 DIY， 这一种小时候从小就喜欢做东西的这个文化，其实一直存在在我们的血液里面，然后一直是我们这一种喜欢创业、喜欢做东西的人里面的一种身体里面的某一个部分。然后结果前几个月，我就知道台湾要发表这个 Make 杂志，然后 Make 杂志台湾的Brian 他就跑来跟我说，我们可不可以一起来做一些什么事？然后他就跟我说，他们想邀请 Dale 来台湾，那有没有兴趣可以一起来共同合作？所以我们就也是非常的荣幸答应了。所以这次才会有Make 加 TEDx 台北这样子的一个促成。那 Dale 他本身其实非常有传奇性，那他有在美国 TED 给过一场演讲。那不知道多少人有看过 Dale 在 TED 演讲？可以举个手吗？还好不是很多。我们来放一段，然后让大家先看电视视频里面的 Dale， 然后我再介绍真人的 Dale 出场。
Idea that I'm just going to tell you over and over until I get you to believe it. That's all of us are makers. I really believe that. All of us are
makers. We're born makers. We have this ability to make things, to grasp things with our hands. We use the words like grasp metaphorically to also think about understanding things. We don't just live, but we make. We create things. Well, I'm going to show you a group of makers from Maker Faire and various places. It doesn't come out particularly well, but that's a particularly tall bicycle, right? It's a scraper bike, it's called, and from Oakland. And this is a particularly small scooter for the gentleman of this size, but he's enthusiast. Begun organizing just me who made show them is something I call swinging in the rain. And if you can barely see it, but it's a controller at top cycles the water to fall just before and after you pass through the bottom of the arc. So imagine a kid, am I going to get wet? Am I going to get wet? No, I didn't get wet. Am I going to get wet? Am I going to get wet? That's the experience of a kind of clever ride. And of course, we have fashion. People are remaking things into fashion. I don't know if this is called a basket bra, but it ought to be something like that. We have art students getting together, taking old radiator parts and doing an iron pour to make something new out of it. They did that in the summer and it was very warm. Now this one takes a little bit to explain. You know what those are, right? Billy Bob or something kind of Billy Bass or something like that? All right. Now the background is the guy who did this is a physicist, right? And here's, he'll explain a little bit about what it does.
I'm Richard Carter, and this is the Sashimi Tabernacle Choir.
This is all computer controlled in an old Volvo. Richard came up from Houston last year to visit us in Detroit here and show the wonderful Sashimi Tabernacle Choir. So, are you a maker? How many people here would say you're a maker? If you raise your hand, that's a pretty good, but there's some of you out there that won't admit that you're makers. And again, think about it. You're makers of food, you're makers of shelter, you're makers of lots of different things. And partly what interests me today is you're makers of your own world, and particularly the role that technology has in your life. You know, you're really a driver or pack.
我要停在这边哈，因为我再放下去就把他要讲的东西都播完了。但他待会 Dale 会跟我们分享一个完整的 maker 的故事。那在他介绍他出来之前呢，我要问大家 ，Are you a maker？ 声音越大声，他就会越想要出来。Are you a maker?
Yes.
Are you a maker?
Yes.
Are you a maker?
Yes.
Let's welcome Dale.
你好。
好。
I'm very happy to be here tonight, and we're going to have my set up here. I'm glad you got to. I hope I have more to show than just the TED Talk here today. How many of you said you were makers? Okay, that's pretty good. We may check in at the end here. All right, here's my book. So, we're going to cover a number of things. I give this talk the title, Leading and Following the Maker Movement, because in many ways, while I may have given it a name and helped to launch it, I am as interested and passionate about following what other people are doing, others who identify themselves as makers, and I want to see what they're doing and talk about them. So we'll look at a number today. But I think making is a mindset and a tool set. And I want to start with the mindset. Let's see if this works. All right, I need to put the USB thing in. It's not working. Okay, which one? Left? Okay. All right, so here's a quote. And I want you to read it, and they can translate it. And I think the really important parts are the world, everything that was made in this world was made by people no smarter than you. And you can change it, you can influence it, you can improve it, you can build your own things that other people use. Anybody know who said this? Anybody? Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs. I actually came across this, it was on a bulletin board at a school. Of course, Jobs got started with Steve Wozniak, and they were makers. They started in a garage, but they also went to some place in the community where they could get together and share their ideas and designs for computers. And Wozniak says, I was willing to do that for free for the rest of my life. Of course, he ended up making a fair amount of money not sharing it for free. That's what the first Apple computer looked like. It's pretty crude. It's made of wood. It's hand-carved. It's missing keys. It's got a wall socket plugged in the top. This is what Apple Computer looked like at the beginning, when it got started. It's not what we see today with our iPhones, our iPads, and MacBooks. That's many, many years later. And it's important that I think when we're looking at the maker movement, to understand that what we're seeing is something at a very early stage, something at the beginning. And who knows really where it goes. Now, an important piece of technology followed that Apple computer, and this is the LaserWriter, about 1985. How many of you, any of you had a LaserWriter? There's a few of you. It was very, very important because it convinced creative people that computers could be useful and it could be something that they could use to create their own work. Initially, it's page design, and new software such as PageMaker is developed so that you could design it on a Mac and then you print it out. So graphic design, page design, desktop publishing is really a first wave of creative work, or of what creatives are doing. And the second wave, those same people who learned how to create pages, usually without any particular technical background, they went from page design to web design. And I was one of them. We started publishing books using the LaserWriter. And then we went to publish a website. This is GNN. It was the first commercial website that I published in 1993. Now, I have an opportunity tonight to tell you a little bit more about that story, because it wouldn't have happened just as Jobs met Wozniak. It would not have happened if I hadn't met someone who's in the audience here tonight. I met a young man from Taiwan who was at the University of California, Berkeley, in taking geography classes. I was interested in HyperCard, which was an Apple program, and I was looking for a version of HyperCard that ran on Unix systems under the X Window system. And this young man at the time had developed a small toolkit called Viola. And he then subsequently used it to build the first graphical web browser. And he happens to be in our audience back there, Pei Wei. Pei, can you stand up? He's very shy, but he's... So it's a piece of web history you might not know that has a significant link to Taiwan. And Pei and I actually saw each other in March when we were part of litigating a patent on the early web. And Pei took the stand, and some of the technology that he developed in 1991 and 92 was being used to defeat a patent that had been obtained in 1995, I guess. And then I was suing a bunch of companies. It was a $600 million lawsuit, and it was Pei's work in prior art that really defeated that. But that's the beginning of the web in terms of commercial websites. This is before Yahoo and Google and everything else, but this is what it looked like. And it's pretty crude, but I kind of think it's beautiful. So I think we're seeing a third wave of creatives, and I call them makers. These are DIY enthusiasts who, as I said earlier, they love what they're doing. They're amateurs. Some of them may become professionals, some of them may have professional lives doing this, but part of it is they get to do what they love to do, they get to make the choices, they get to enjoy their own work on their own terms. And as important as the LaserWriter was to desktop publishing, it's the 3D printer that's becoming kind of the center of this new form of making. Recently I was at a conference and a group went off and they started to brainstorm on what is a maker. Partially because same idea, and working across and the physical interact with the physical world. I think one of the key insights I had in on computers, they would be hosted. A mindset of playfulness, experiment, try things. Again. And finally, and I think this creates a culture. The world can be improved, solved, things can be changed, and we can do it. We have the tools, the knowledge, and the ability to do it. But it's very the thing software as their main interested in hardware. They were interested in projects. Just as there were open source software projects, I thought there would be, we wanted to focus on hardware projects. And in particular, in magazines, there are magazines for woodworking and cooking and gardening. Those are called DIY magazines. And you wouldn't buy that magazine unless you were cooking or gardening or using woodworking tools. So I thought technology really doesn't have that DIY magazine. It has magazines like Wired, which are great, but they don't really give you the recipe behind how something was done. So we started off doing this, and we're up to 30 issues, and it's a quarterly magazine. But this is what those magazines looked like a long time ago. Up here, 1961, or it might be 67, 61, 35 cents. And, you know, we were making go-karts, and we're still making go-karts and things up here. There's the guy I mentioned in the video with the drill press operated scooter. And, you know, the grocery cart, everybody wants to motorize the grocery cart. But one of the interesting things underneath Scientists on the Brink of Hell, which I kind of wanted to know what that was about, is make your own printed circuits. Something that makers are really interested in today. So 1961 to 2012. This was 1944, What to Make. And it was a special issue of Popular Mechanics. And you know, this idea of tinkering was, particularly in America, much more common, much more something that people grew up doing and thinking about. So in many ways, I wanted to reinvigorate that for the 21st century, bring it back with new ideas, new technologies, and you might say we put a new face on making and tinkering. And this is our issue on biosensing, and we have a number of interesting things in there, projects that relate to that. And Carol is a surgical roboticist, and she's not actually teaching you how to do surgery in the issue, but she has a lot of, I think she does this control machines with your eyes, controlling games and other things. So a DIY superhero. One of the projects that we have in that issue is a DIY Geiger counter. And the idea really, following Fukushima disaster, is that people suddenly had an interest in having their own Geiger counter, and they couldn't find them. And communities online got together and started figuring out how to do this, and we published one of those instruction sets for doing it. Again, they didn't want to believe that it was enough to get the government's radiation report. They wanted to know what it was in their own yard and you know, in their neighborhood. So these things sometimes seem esoteric, but all of a sudden become very useful. So the maker movement, I think, has these trends in it that are shaping it. One is open hardware, or open source hardware. Just as we've had open source software, we're beginning to see this sort of layer of open source hardware come in. Open software, fabrication tools, personal fabrication tools such as laser cutters, 3D printers, and the like. Kits, I think, are a big component of making, and the fact that makers are increasingly connected online and in their communities. And I think out of that we see a growing culture of creativity. New groups of people have new tools to create things. And what they're creating looks a little different than what we've seen before. So open source hardware is things like Arduino, MakerBot, DIY drones. They're using open components, and also I guess the key part of open source hardware is they're sharing the designs and specifications for the hardware, and literally anyone could make them. This helps to grow a community of people who have shared knowledge. You could create a project using some chipset that wasn't Arduino, but when it's not working right, you want to find a community that can help you, regardless of what that application is. The Arduino community is there to help you out, and you can find other people who know how to use it, who can teach you how to use it. I think one of the big things that we're seeing on the internet and in our day is the democratization of technology. And this means that the price of tools are coming down, the access to tools is greater, the sophistication is still high in the tools, but the ease of use is also high. So, in effect, amateurs and pros use the same tools. This is what happened with the LaserWriter in desktop publishing. Anybody could print a book. It didn't mean they could sell it, but it did mean they could go through that process and manage it themselves. Personal fabrication means you can make one of something. You can make small numbers. And to think of this, importantly, if you had an idea for a web page, a website today, or an app, there are a few barriers in your way to creating that. You might not know what PHP is, or you might have to learn various things along the way, but it's a pretty straight path to creating that. When you're thinking and you have an idea for a piece of hardware or a product, you have to learn how to design things, you have to learn to do some engineering, you have to find the tools and come up with a manufacturing process. 10 years ago, that was almost too formidable for most people to do without working for a large company or having access to those tools easily. Today, I think the barriers are lowering and you can come in and do this much more easily. It's really what we're seeing is a kind of prototyping revolution, that you can take that idea and create one or two of them and begin to take it out and show it to someone and hand it to them. Let them play with it and give you feedback. That's much better than having to describe something that's only in your head. This is from a visit to Georgia Tech University in Atlanta, Georgia. And it was a student's desk in their kind of makerspace area. And I thought, this is kind of the future of work in the makerspace. We've got a couple of monitors with design tools on there. Over here we have an EggBot, which is a small CNC machine that will print on an egg or a ping pong ball. You know, we have a screwdriver down there, we have wire cutters, we have a 3D printer, and we have a copy of the magazine, which makes me happy. So the other trend I think that's shaping this is that the makers are interconnected. We used, at least in America, we had this idea sometimes called the lone tinkerer, someone who is off on his own in a shed or making things. But today, when you start to make something, you pretty much find people in your community based on your interest, your profession, your location. And I think this is something really important to, I think, come away from this meeting with, is how in, say, Taipei or Taiwan as a whole, how do you begin connecting people up? It's not enough just to be connected online. We're seeing, as I'll talk about later, the growth of and spread of people wanting to get together physically to share tools and share ideas. As I said in my TED Talk, you know, we could believe that this was just a phenomenon for a few people, a few geeks out there are makers. But what if the opposite is true? That we're all makers. That it's something in our nature and something within us, just as we might say that we're all creative. We sometimes talk ourselves out of that and say someone else is more creative than I am. Someone is more capable than I am. And it only makes us passive. It only makes us withdraw. I want people to step forward and try things. And DIY is really about taking that first step. The first step has to come from you to decide to do this, that it's worthwhile, it's meaningful, and perhaps fun. We started Maker Faire in 2007, and it's a huge event in the Bay Area. We just, about 2 weeks ago, concluded our 7th annual Maker Faire in the Bay Area. Brian, you were there. Is anybody else here at Maker Faire? There, Jason was? Okay, great. It's hard to describe, and I'm not going to spend too many words doing it. Once you experience it, I think you will get it. There we go. Dolphin mobile. Isn't that just mesmerizing? And the real interesting thing is, it'd be enough if it was just an art piece. But of course, because they're makers, it's controlled with an Android phone, and you can make the fish swim faster, or you can turn them off or on. So this year, we'll have 60 Maker Fairs around the world. Green are places that are having their first Maker Faire, and blue is where they're having, you know, a second or more Maker Faire. So you can see lots of green on there. And I don't believe we have Taiwan on there at all yet. So the other places where makers get together, I use the term maker spaces, also hacker spaces. There's commercial places like Tech Shop, they're Fab Labs. They go by different names. But the important part is they bring together people so that we have access to tools, shared space, resources like materials, but most importantly, the expertise of each other. It's a place where you can go to learn to do something or find someone who knows something that you don't know. And it's amazing what's coming out of these spaces. So this is the Dallas Makerspace, kind of a collage of photos here. They have a woodworking shop, they have a metal shop, they have a blacksmithing area, they're working on an electric car, they have a craft room, a wet lab, a number of different spaces in there. In the wet lab, they have someone's working on a kit for a biofuel cell. This one on this side is he was growing fabric from bacteria. So thin sheets of fabric and then going to make some kind of garment out of it. But I walked through this last March and I saw the work that was going on there. And it was like going to an R&D lab and checking out the experiments that are going on there. And in many ways, I bet a lot more interesting than the average R&D lab. I call this grassroots innovation. It's stuff that's growing up from the bottom, almost without much support or supervision. It's happening on its own and is connecting to new people to new ideas. Maker spaces, we see them freestanding. We see them in science centers. We see them in libraries, in churches, and museums. These are largely in America, but we're seeing them outside of America. As far as I know, there's not a hackerspace or makerspace in Taipei yet. Is that right? I thought if someone could correct me if I'm wrong. But I predict by next year you'll have one. You might even have two. Here's a project from a hackerspace in Louisville, Kentucky, and they're doing high altitude ballooning, and they are actually building a rig to do a transatlantic crossing of a balloon, of a robotic balloon that can adjust its own height, so this was again where 3 or 4 people got together at a hackerspace and came up with this project. It's not funded by anybody. It is simply, they're doing it because they love doing it. As you might know in Make Magazine, we've covered how makers are beginning to explore space in their own way. As you might know, NASA is the space agency in America, and it's kind of giving way increasingly to private space exploration. And these are funded companies that are doing what NASA used to do. But a story that's not often told as much is that makers are also doing what NASA used to do. This is an article on building a satellite, your own satellite, for $8,000. They used to spend millions of dollars building those. An interesting thing that goes on a little further, these guys actually did work at NASA, and they're in the process of leaving and starting a company to build these satellites because there are customers out there that want to use them. I think a big part of the maker movement is kits. Really the predecessor to the Apple computer were personal computers that came from kits. In those magazines that I showed, they had ads where you could buy a kit, a Heath kit, or other kinds of kits. And we're seeing a resurgence, a return of them. We sell some of them in our maker shed. Other people create them and have started businesses in them. Makers are starting to figure out this is an interesting new business opportunity. And I won't go too much into it today, but I think kits are really important in this special issue of Make. We had an economist say that characterize kits as an engine of innovation. They're a way. Did you know, for instance, that the first steam engine was built from a kit? James Watt designed it as a kit, not a finished product. A kit is something you can take apart and customize. That car up at the top right from Local Motors is an open source car. You can buy the parts, go to their micro factory in Arizona and make the car, and a weekend later you're driving it away. The other thing I wanted to touch on that I think is really important, when I walk around Maker Faire, particularly in the Bay Area, I see lots of kids. They're practically hyped, amped up. They're really fascinated by what they see, and it makes them want to do stuff. They want to get involved, they want to become makers. But often there's not a place in their community that has the expertise and the tools for them to do that. And I really believe that maker spaces belong in schools, that we ought to extend the maker movement into schools so that kids are learning how to do this. And particularly kids that aren't motivated to follow traditional academic approaches. We have a program called Makerspace on makerspace.com that its goal is to establish the collaborative practices of making in up to 1,000 high schools around the world in 3 years. That means getting kids a space, giving them tools and software and hardware, and then really encouraging them to realize their dreams, to figure out what they want to build and work with others to do that. This year we started our first example of issue of the magazine for kids. So this is all, we had a best summer ever issue. These are 50 projects that kids can do themselves. And we see a lot of demand that kids want to do this, and we want to help parents figure out how to do it, and other places in the community. This is Super Awesome Sylvia, and it's a 3D issue, so they have glasses inside so you can see all the amazing feats. So kind of in wrapping here, the maker movement, as I see it, is to foster a sense of a participatory culture that invites and inspires all kinds of creative people and communities to share what they love to make and what they do. And I'm pretty convinced that this is something that will change the world. It already is changing the world. It offers new opportunities. It creates, I believe makers are a new source of innovation, and I believe it is ultimately going to transform education. And I hope tonight that it plants a seed in your brain, that maybe this talk and maybe coming together is a catalyst for thinking about what does this mean here in Taiwan. I've had wonderful conversations in the last day or two with people asking me questions about what does this mean and why are you here? And I think it's simply to maybe help light that spark and help each of you find each other as a small nucleus, a small core that can go out and work the community and find, where are the places where people make things here? Sometimes it's older people are still doing interesting work out there that you don't know about. And what is, I've kind of seen in some of the cities we've worked in, say, well, where can I find someone who does vacuum, injection molding? Where can I find a plasma cutter? Where can I find a vinyl cutter? And these kind of things, there's someone in this audience that knows the answers to those questions, or each of them. And so I do think that making can lead to business opportunities, but almost preceding the commerce is this sense of community. It's what we felt, I think, in the early web, that people were creating because they could. Came commercial opportunities and personal opportunities. And that's why the way it did. So, in closing, I just would like to thank Fulon Publishing for bringing me here. We do have Make Korea. Are you on your 3rd issue? 4th issue of Make. And we have some out here. I'm really excited to see it in Taiwan. And it's something that on this visit I've been in Seoul and Taiwan, and each country now has its own language edition, as well as some of the books like Processing and Arduino that are out there. And I think I kind of look at it as we're helping to provide some of the tools that you need to get started. But the real DIY sense is it has to come from you, and it has to come from you building a community that becomes a great resource here and connects you to what's going on around the world. Thank you very much.
have time for Q&A. Leading the Q&A, why don't we ask the audience to share their experiences?
It's great.
That was wonderful. Quite interesting.
I don't like that.
有没有人要然后跟 Dale 分享的？你自己做的一些东西啊，玩的游戏啊。如果没有的话，我可以请我的朋友 Ben 吗？Is friend of mine Ben? He's done great stuff with MakerBot. 再讲
Sure.
Face everybody. Introduce yourself.
Can you get on the net?
Oh, you want to show the stuff that his works on?
I'm not beyond, right? Oh, can't believe it. Well,
Just talk.
Yeah.
I designed an electric bicycle, very high-powered electric bicycle that can travel about 100 kilometers an hour. There's a website on the United States called Endless Sphere, and anyone who's interested in building electric bikes can go on and collaborate with a lot of very smart and talented people. Without any pictures, I really don't know.
How'd you get the idea for it?
I don't know, inspiration. Sometimes something just catches you and you go with it, a feeling. I can't really explain it. It's the opposite of science. It's different from how the left brain works. A lot of times we ignore the right brain. But the right brain is when you have to slow down, stop thinking, and meditate a little bit, and hear your inner voice, and let the inspiration or the idea come first. And then the left brain kicks in, and then you start to execute your idea. But if you don't come from that inspirational idea first, then it's an uphill battle when you're building. I know this is very esoteric, but it's what I think is the most important aspect of creation. I mean, technical skills, scientific knowledge, all that's essential, but really it's the initial inspiration that drives you to learn all these things. Otherwise, so it's kind of...
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, is a lot of this is about taking your ideas seriously enough to act on them, right?
Exactly. It's passion, and it's communion with yourself. Creation, I believe, is all about yourself, and doing it for your love, and to put a piece of you into your creation, rather than creating something for somebody else. I believe it's as simple as that.
谢谢 Ben。
Okay.
有没有其他人想要分享？我觉得问掉这个问题，我们还有一些时间。I think there is a question over there.
可以讲中文吗？
可以啊，可以啊，
英文太烂了。不好意思，其实我是那个 Mac 杂志非常忠实的爱好者。然后几年前我有跟几个，就是我先讲我背景哈，我是念艺术背景出身的，然后后来因为研究数位艺术或者接触到自由软体，然后后来接触到自由软体之后，这几年就自由硬体，尤其是 Arduino 整个冒上来之后，就开始跟很多朋友一起在玩这些 open source 或者自由软体的东西，然后顺便也是跟大家分享到，顺便广告我们家社群，就是我们在台北成立一个叫 Open Lab 台北的社群，然后主要是我们在网络上交流制作的这种任何就是奇奇怪怪很难去被定义在设计或是艺术或是任何使用上的一些创作，然后我们也在做这个交流。其实，
所以你的问题是什么？
其实我现在对不起，你先讲太多，就是我刚才有提到，刚才那个讲者有讲到说有关 Makerspace， 对，因为我们后来在宝藏岩国际艺术村那边有申请到一个空间，然后我们也在经营这样一个 Makerspace 的概念在营运。那其实我很想知道说国外就是怎样在 run 这些东西的。 对不起，绕我大学，其实
知道，我翻译。
So I think it's to elaborate on makerspace. So I think there's a lot of variety of them. Some hacker spaces are about 3 rows wide and so many rows chairs deep. They're very small. They're not all big spaces. I visited one in Massachusetts 2 weeks ago called Artisans Asylum, which I found really fascinating, quite large. They also had renters in it. People would rent small space in there. They still, some of them were craftsmen and others, they wanted to be together. But they were also teaching workshops for others who came in, and they were able to pay their rent that way. And many of them donated tools to the space that could be used by a broader public. I think the real key thing on a makerspace like this is to figure out the governance of it. Is it a business? Is it a nonprofit? It usually needs more than one person to start it, and that person has to find ways to really include others and share that workload. If they're kind of a tyrant, they really end up running people off, and if they're just sort of a workaholic, they burn out. So one of the questions I ask when I visit a space is sort of who's in charge and how long have they been in charge. If you see that, like in a nonprofit sense, they have a board and they take turns running it, that's usually a healthy sign.
我大概稍微诠释一下那个 Dale 讲的。那基本上 makerspace 有各种不同的形式，然后有的是很大的空间里面有很多组人做不同的东西，有的是很小的空间里面只有两三个人在做自己的东西，所以它是一种比较是意义上的一个诠释，就是说这个空间是让大家 DIY 创作的一个地方，并没有一个特别的规格。那他看过很多的地方，各种都有各种不同领域的方式。但是如果说你要成立一个 makerspace， 最重要的事情就是先了解它的模式是什么。它是一个只是大家聚在一起玩一玩的俱乐部呢，还是它是一个商业一门生意，还是它是一个 NPO、NGO 的概念，非营利组织的概念？所以就是先要想好这件事，然后通常你在做这个 makerspace 的时候，一个人一定搞不起来的，一定要找一群人一起玩这样子，然后把它变成是一个 community based 的这样子的一个活动。
Yeah, and the most important part is the community. That I've seen spaces that have the tools, they have a nice big open space, but if they don't really have the community coming in there, it's really not vital.
所以最重要的是社群。Dale 说他看到很多地方有很棒的设备，还有机器，可是如果没有很好的社群一起参与的话，其实是没有用的，徒劳无功的。我们再开放一个问题，因为还有OK。
Yeah, there's one other space that's pretty new.
Can you hold on a second? Pass on the microphone.
By the way, people can contact you here at the end of the meeting and maybe if they're
如果大家对做 makerspace 有兴趣的话，可以找他聊一聊。刚刚那个观众 ，please.
So there's one other space that's pretty new. It's mostly software focused, but they've got some tools kind of slowly starting to get going. That's maker friendly. It's at the Chenda Yongkong JA campus. It's an open space. If you want to see, it's pretty easy to get. There's like I think 1.5 floors that are there. And if you want money for projects, there's even like a group there who's interested in like helping with fun stuff. So
is Vicky running it? Vicky Chu?
yes.
Okay, I remember.
Good, thank you.
我刚才稍微翻译一下刚作为 What's your name? Excuse me, what's your name? Jason. You also Jason. 我翻译一下这位朋友他说的。如果大家对这个 maker 的东西有兴趣，做 DIY 或是做东西的话，政大公器中心在金华街那边有一个空间，然后他们有提供这样子的一些设备。那有兴趣的人欢迎可以到那边创立坊，大家叫创立坊。Maybe we have time for one more. Maybe 再一个问题。 Let me ask you one.
Okay, good.
What's your maker project? 我问他说他最喜欢的 maker 的 project 是什么？
That's like asking your favorite children, you know? I'll say the Dolphin Mobile. Right now is my current favorite. I really like that project. But, it really doesn't matter. It was fun walking around like Maker Faire Seoul just to see how different things were and the reasons, and talking to people why they do it. I sometimes even saying which because they're all kind of interesting, and I wouldn't want to see a Maker Faire that only had things in that I was interested in. It's much broader than that.
他说，问他这个问题好像问说他最喜欢的小孩是哪一个，所以是很不公平的。但是如果真的要说一个的话，他最喜欢的是那个会动的海豚那一个，然后各种不同的project， 其实他都觉得非常的 excited， 所以去到那边，他通常就是觉得每一个都是非常的有意思这样子。Well, thank you, Dale.
Thank you.
It's been nice having you.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah. And Dale, this is your email and the Facebook.
Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah, you might have like 300 friends requests.
That's great.
Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone.